In a small town, news travels fast. Everyone knows who got promoted. Everyone knows who bought the new car. Everyone knows whose kid got into college and whose marriage is in trouble. There are no secrets in a place where you went to school with the person who cuts your hair and your accountant coaches your son's soccer team. In the spring of 2002, the news was that Daniel Marsh had just been given his first real raise. He was 26 years old. He'd been working at Callaway Insurance for 3 years, started as a junior claims processor, worked harder than anyone expected, and just been promoted to senior adjuster. $12,000 more a year than he was making last month. His father heard about it before Daniel even got home. That's how small towns work. That evening, his father shook his hand at the dinner table with the specific pride of a man whose son has confirmed that the world works the way he always said it did. Keep your head down, do good work, and they'll recognize it. He'd been saying that since Daniel was 8 years old. Now it was true. Daniel believed it too. Why wouldn't he? The evidence was right there. A raise, recognition, solid ground. What he didn't know, what no one told him over that dinner, was that he had just stepped onto a treadmill, and that the faster he ran, the faster it would go. 6 months after the promotion, Daniel's life looked exactly like a raise was supposed to look. He'd moved into a bigger apartment, 2 bedrooms instead of 1, because he could afford it now, and it felt like the right move for someone at his level. He'd bought a new car, nothing extravagant, just newer and more reliable than the one that had started making a noise he didn't trust. He'd upgraded his phone, joined the nicer gym across town, started going to the steakhouse on Friday nights instead of the diner. None of it felt like overspending. All of it felt like arriving, like becoming the person the raise said he was. The raise was $12,000 a year. His new expenses added up to just over $11,000. He had gained, net, about $80 a month. He didn't calculate this. Nobody does in the moment. You don't sit down with a spreadsheet the week after a raise and ask, how much of this am I actually keeping? You feel the number. You spend from the feeling. 8 years passed. Daniel got 3 more raises. Each one felt like progress. Each one was followed, within 6 to 8 months, by a quiet expansion of his life. A better neighborhood, a newer car, a holiday that cost a little more than the one before. The house he bought in 2007, at the peak of the market, with a mortgage that felt manageable on his salary at the time. By 2010, Daniel was earning nearly twice what he made when he started. He was also spending nearly twice what he made when he started. He was 34 years old. He had a mortgage, a car payment, a home equity loan he'd taken out to redo the kitchen, 2 credit cards he rotated balances between, and a savings account with enough in it to cover about 6 weeks of his current life. From the outside, and in a small town, the outside is always watching, Daniel looked like a success. Nice house on Elm Street, new truck in the driveway, member of the country club his father had always admired from a distance, but never joined. From the inside, Daniel was running as fast as he could just to stay in the same place. He just hadn't stopped long enough to notice. It was the company summer barbecue, the kind of event where everyone pretends to enjoy themselves and leaves the moment it's socially acceptable. Daniel ended up talking to a man named Pete Kowalski. Pete worked in the mailroom, had worked there for 11 years, made about a third of what Daniel made, drove a 10-year-old Honda, brought lunch from home every day. Daniel had always assumed Pete's life was smaller than his, tighter, more constrained. Then Pete mentioned, casually, in the way people mention things they don't realize are remarkable, that he was thinking about retiring in 4 years. At 47. Daniel held his paper plate and said nothing for a moment. How? He asked finally. Pete shrugged. I never spent more than I needed to. Anything left over went into the market. Been doing it since I was 25. It adds up. He said it the way you'd describe how you make coffee. No drama, no philosophy. Just a thing he did. Daniel drove home from that barbecue in his $40,000 truck and thought about Pete Kowalski's 10-year-old Honda the entire way. That weekend, Daniel did something he had never done in 14 years of earning a salary. He sat down and looked at all of it. Every account, every debt, every monthly obligation. Not just the number that landed in his checking account every 2 weeks, but the full picture. What he owed, what he was paying, what he actually owned outright, versus what the bank owned and he was renting from them with interest. It took him most of Saturday. The mortgage, $312,000 remaining. The home equity loan, $41,000. The truck, $22,000 left on the note. Credit card 1, $8,000. Credit card 2, $5,500. The personal loan he'd taken out 2 years ago to cover a gap he didn't want to think about. $11,000. He wrote it all down, added it up. Just over $390,000 in debt. He had been working for 14 years. He had received 5 raises. He currently earned more money than anyone in his family had ever earned. And he had, on paper, less than nothing. Every raise he had ever received had been absorbed, silently, automatically, without a single conscious decision, by a life that expanded to consume it. He sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The house was quiet. Outside, someone was mowing their lawn. Ordinary Saturday sounds. He thought about Pete Kowalski. 4 years from retirement. Third of his salary. 10-year-old Honda. 3 months after that Saturday at the kitchen table, Daniel opens an investment account. He has read enough by now to know the basics. Index funds, compound interest, time in the market. He moves $500 a month into it. Money he freed up by canceling 3 subscriptions, downgrading his phone plan, and stopping the Friday steakhouse dinners. For 4 months, he sticks to it. He feels for the first time in years like he is moving in a direction instead of just moving. Then his wife finds out. Her name is Karen. They've been married for 9 years. She knew about the Saturday with the bank statements. He had told her, carefully, that things were tighter than they'd been managing. But she hadn't seen the full number, $390,000. When she sees it, when he finally lays it out completely the way he should have done months ago, she is very quiet for a long time. Then she isn't quiet anymore. You've been moving money without telling me. I was trying to fix it. You should have told me there was something to fix. She isn't wrong. That's the part that makes it harder. She isn't wrong about any of it. Not about the secrecy, not about the years of spending that neither of them examined closely enough. I mean, not about the fact that $500 a month into an index fund is not going to solve $390,000 of debt in any time frame that matters. The argument isn't really about the money. It's about all the years they looked at their life from the outside. The nice house, the truck, the country club, and never sat down together and looked at it from the inside. They don't separate, but something shifts. The house feels different after that conversation. Smaller in some ways, more honest. 2 months after the argument, Daniel gets his 6th raise. $15,000 a year. The biggest one yet. His boss calls it a recognition of his leadership, his consistency, his value to the company. Daniel thanks him, shakes his hand, walks back to his desk. And for the first time in his career, he feels nothing. Not happiness, not pride, not the particular warmth of being recognized. Because he knows now what he didn't know the first 5 times. He knows that without a deliberate decision about where that money goes the moment it arrives, it will disappear into his life the same way every other raise disappeared. Silently, automatically, without a trace. He goes home that night and tells Karen before he tells anyone else. Oh, they sit at the kitchen table. The same table where he did the calculation 8 months ago. And they decide together what happens to the $15,000. Not most of it, all of it, before it touches their checking account. Before they can feel it and spend from the feeling. It's not a romantic moment, it's a practical one. But it's the first financial decision they've made together in 9 years of marriage. 6 weeks after the raise, Callaway Insurance announces a merger. The acquiring company has its own claims department. Fully staffed, Daniel's entire division is being evaluated. Some people will be absorbed into the new structure, others won't. Decisions in 90 days. Daniel stands in the parking lot after the all-hands meeting and does the math he couldn't have done a year ago. If he loses this job today, the job he has held for 22 years, the job his entire financial life is built around, he has 6 weeks of savings. 6 weeks to find something in a small town where everyone already knows everyone, where the insurance market is not large, where starting over at 44 looks very different than starting over at 26. He built an enormous life on top of a single salary, and the salary was never as solid as it felt. He calls Karen from the parking lot. She picks up on the second ring. He tells her everything, standing beside the $40,000 truck he's still paying off. Okay, she says, not panicked, just present. What do we do? The 90 days are the most clarifying period of Daniel's professional life. He and Karen spend the first weekend building what they call the real budget. Not the budget of their current life, but the budget of the life they could actually sustain if the salary disappeared tomorrow. They cancel the country club. They put the truck up for sale and buy a used car with the equity. They call the credit card companies and negotiate rates. They stop rotating balances and start paying them down in order, smallest to largest. It's uncomfortable. In a small town, these things are noticed. The truck disappears from the driveway. They stop coming to the club. Someone asks Karen at the grocery store if everything's okay. "Everything's fine," she says. "We're just making some changes." At work, Daniel does something he's never done before. He makes himself indispensable not to his division, but to the incoming company. He learns their systems. He volunteers for the integration committee. He becomes the person the new structure needs, rather than defending the role the old structure had given him. On day 87 of the 90, he gets a call from the new regional director. They want to keep him. Different title, slightly lower base salary, about $8,000 less than he was making, but stable, confirmed. He takes it without negotiating. Then he goes home and tells Karen. 2 years after the merger scare, Daniel and Karen's life is smaller by most external measures. The house on Elm Street is the same. They couldn't sell it without taking a loss, so they stayed and kept paying it down. But almost everything else is different. The debt has gone from $390,000 to $260,000. The investment account, the one he started with $500 a month and now contributes $1,200 to every month before anything else, has grown to just over $30,000. It's not life-changing money, but it's money that isn't attached to whether Callaway Insurance, or whoever owns it next, decides to keep him. Pete Kowalski retired last spring at 47, exactly as planned. Daniel went to the small party the office threw for him, brought a card, shook his hand. "Now, how does it feel?" Daniel asked. Pete thought about it for a moment. "Like I can breathe," he said. "That's really all it is. Like I can finally breathe." Daniel drove home thinking about all the raises, all the years of feeling like he was moving forward, all the money that had passed through his hands and left nothing behind. He wasn't angry about it anymore, just clear. Daniel is 44 years old. He still works at Callaway, under its third name now, after 2 more acquisitions. He still gets raises, though he doesn't remember the last time one made him feel anything in particular. What he does now, the morning after every raise, is sit at the kitchen table with Karen and decide together what happens to the money before they can feel it. It takes about 20 minutes. Then, they get on with their day. The debt is manageable now, not gone, but structured, predictable, shrinking. The investment account is real, not enough to retire on, but enough that the threat of a phone call from a regional director no longer feels like the end of everything. In a small town, people notice things. Some of his colleagues have asked about the car, the used one, not the truck. He tells them the truck was too much to maintain. It's not untrue. What he doesn't say, what would take too long to explain over coffee in the break room, is that for 20 years he confused the raise with the progress. That every time his income went up, he felt like he was building something, when really he was just feeding a machine he had never examined. He thinks about his father sometimes. The handshake at the dinner table in 2002. The pride. The absolute certainty that this was how it worked. Keep your head down, do good work, and they'll recognize it. They did recognize it 6 times, and each recognition cost him more than it gave him, until the day he finally decided to recognize something himself. The raise was never the problem. The raise was always just money. What he did with it, that was the whole story. Somewhere today, someone is getting a raise. They're going to feel it. That warm, specific feeling of being recognized, of earning more than you did last month, of the future looking a little more like you imagined it. And within 6 months, maybe 12, maybe 18, their life will have expanded to meet it. Not through bad decisions, not through recklessness, just through the completely natural, completely invisible process of spending from the feeling instead of from a plan. Daniel's story isn't a cautionary tale. It's a common one. The raise comes, the life expands, the number in the bank account stays roughly the same, and nobody sits down to ask why. The question isn't whether to earn more. The question is what you decide, deliberately, before the feeling takes over, to do with it when it arrives. Most people never ask that question. Not because they're careless, because nobody told them it was the right question to ask. This is one story. There are more.